All right. So, welcome everybody. Thank you all so much for being here for our latest episode of Birds and Bytes. My name is Edward. I am president of Chicago Ornithological Society, and I'm super excited for this evening's program. Couple quick ground rules though, as I already mentioned just before we hit record, but again, if you don't want to be seen on camera, you don't want to be heard making weird noises in the background, go ahead and mute yourself now, turn your cameras off now. I will also be coming through with the mute hammer if you guys are making any weird noises. Additionally, we will have time for Q&A after the presentation. It's just a little less chaotic on Zoom if we just kind of hold our questions for the end. So if you have burning questions, go ahead and actually put them in the chat box. And then what we'll do is we'll be able to call on you at the end of the program and you can ask your question in person, make things a little bit more personal here. Additionally, this is a long-running series now, COVID-born, but still going strong here series. It's a riff on our in-person events we used to do called Birds and Beers. But obviously these programs are free and open to the public and supported by you guys, the participants and members. So if you're not already a member of COS, why the heck not? Scoot on over to our website, chicagobirder.org. And go ahead and become a member and support awesome programming like this. I think I don't really have any other major updates to give here. You guys didn't come here to listen to me talk. So I think I'm gonna go ahead and turn it over to our special guest here. Gonna get a big round of virtual applause for Geoff LeBaron, who will be going through the long storied history of the Christmas bird count and how observations that all of you guys once or many times on those cold winter days is helping us understand and save birds. So Geoff, go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, Edward. Also, Stephanie, I see you're here. Thanks for inviting me for this. I always love talking about the Christmas bird count. By way of introduction, I've been a birder for my whole life. I've been in charge of the Christmas bird count program for Audubon since 1987. Actually on December 7th of 1987. And it's a very different program these days than it was when I first started. When I first started in charge of the CBC, it was 100% paper. I sent out the same 16-page paper booklet to every single compiler everywhere. They filled them out by hand. I hand edited all of them. We sent it off for typesetting, and then we had to proofread the typesetting, and the end result was what some of you may remember, the 700-page or so telephone book issue that basically contained all the results of all the CBCs that were done in that season. Starting in 1998, 1999, we actually computerized what was then the 100-year database and developed the online data entry system, which we have these days. And after the 103rd CBC in 2003 and 2002, we stopped printing even the 128-page summary booklet. So literally the entire system now is online. So that is quite a change, and it's been an interesting transition or series of transitions, as you might very well guess. But let me go ahead and share my screen, and I will start to tell you about the CBC. And Edward, can you let me know for sure that things are running as we hoped?
Looks good on this end.
Alrighty. So CBC was begun on Christmas Day of 1900. Except we're not advancing. Why are we not advancing? Oh, there we go. And around the late 1800s and the 1880s and 1890s, there was a growing conservation awareness for the need to conserve wildlife rather than harvest it. The millinery trade was causing tremendous declines in especially colonial water birds, herons, egrets, also terns and things like that. Entire birds, not just the feathers and the plumes, but sometimes entire birds were on hats or on brooches and whatever. And the nesting colonies were being just decimated by the people going in, by the plume hunters going in and just basically wiping out these colonies. And the birds were in tremendous decline. It was a catastrophe. Hundreds of thousands of birds were being killed and taken every year, and the colonies were just disappearing all up and down the coasts, and the egrets and herons and terns and all that stuff were just really in decline. What started to happen is that like I said, there was a growing awareness for the need to conserve wildlife rather than to harvest it, and this sort of became what was initially called the Audubon movement, to be named after John James Audubon, the bird artist. And in the late 1800s, the initial Audubon societies were formed. Many of them were independent at the time. They were all independent at the time, and many of them still are. It wasn't until actually 1905 where what was then called the National Association of Audubon Societies was formed, which eventually became National Audubon. Around 1899, Frank Chapman, who was the bird curator at the American Museum of Natural History and an ornithologist, recognized the fact that birds were just being decimated, and he thought that we should try to do something to promote the idea of conservation rather than consumption of wildlife. There had been a tradition called the side hunt, where people would choose sides and go out and hunt for the holiday season. And what Frank Chapman proposed, and he could do this because actually he was the editor-in-chief and owned basically and produced Bird Lore, his own publication about birds. He proposed to have people go out on Christmas Day and count birds rather than shoot them. So that on Christmas Day of 1900, the first CBC was actually conducted. And even that first year, it was a continental effort. There were 25 counts done, a total of 27 observers, and those 25 counts spanned from the East Coast to the West Coast and also up into Canada. Since then, every year during the holiday season, birders have gone out, and I suspect that most of you on this call have done CBCs. The combined effort of all the people doing all these counts, and the key thing is that we're not only counting the birds, but we're also counting we're adding up, keeping track of the amount of effort that we're expending to count those birds. The CBC database has become one of only 2 large-scale databases that's available for looking at what's happening with the birds across the Americas, and especially in North America. And the other database is the Breeding Bird Survey, which was begun by Chan Robbins in 1966. So the CBC, it's as most of you know, it's fun. Up until last year, it was very social. We're hoping to be able to get back to that in a at least somewhat under control COVID environment. It's a tradition. It becomes a tremendous tradition for people across the Americas, really, to do their CBCs and compile their CBCs. People learn. It's an educational experience, and it can be a really good mentoring opportunity for new birders of any age and ability. And as I said, it's become incredibly scientifically valuable. And now remember, there was no CBC database until about 2000. And it was at that point that the entire 100-year database was computerized and became available online for researchers to use. It started off in just the United States and Canada, and it's grown to be throughout the Western Hemisphere, plus some of the US protectorate islands in the South Pacific, Saipan, Tinian, Rota, and Guam. The reason, generally what we're doing is we're keeping track of the birds that spend a significant portion of their life cycle in North America. And the reason we include the islands down there is because a lot of the shorebirds, of course, they're breed up in Arctic Canada and Alaska. They go down to those islands for the winter. Well, for the northern winter, it's actually the endless summer for them. So this shows you where, this is the map of the expected circles for the upcoming 122nd Christmas bird count. You can see we do have counts from above the Arctic Circle all the way down into the heart of South America. Occasionally there are counts done further south. I have, for quite a while, I had a count that was done every year in the Drake Passage between southern Argentina and Chile and Antarctica. The funding ran out for that trip, so that hasn't been done in a while. I would love to get it back if we can. But it's grown tremendously, as you can see, over the last 122 years. As I said, the first year in 1900, there were 27 observers on 25 counts, including some areas that are still done and have been done literally every year since then, including Central Park, some of the more metropolitan areas in the Northeast. There was the first year there was a count in Baldwin, Louisiana. I think it was Monterey, California, Pueblo, Colorado. So, like I said, it was it was international even that first year. So it grew from 27 observers to the 121st count was quite a bit of a dip because a lot of counts were canceled because of COVID. But in the 120th count, we had almost 82,000 observers on the CBCs and 2,646 different circles that were included in the database that year. Now, I should say 82,000 observers isn't 82,000 birders, because if I go on 3 Christmas bird counts, I'm actually 3 different statistical observers. The average person who does a CBC goes on 2 counts. So the number of birders actually included in the CBC is probably around 40,000 or maybe 50. It's still a lot of people, and it's still an incredibly meaningful and important thing for our understanding of what's happening with birds across the Americas. So the earlier picture was of Frank Chapman in his younger years. This old geezer is actually Frank Chapman in his later years. Frank was editor and chief of bird lore until 1934, and he also was in charge of the Christmas bird count from the first CBC until 1934. Interestingly, in 1934, Chan Robbins, as a young birder, started both compiling and participating on CBCs, and until every year until the 116th CBC, from that point forward, Chan actually participated and compiled on Christmas counts. So until the 116th CBC, we could actually measure the entire span of the program with the involvement of 2 people, Frank Chapman and Chan Robbins. Unfortunately, Chan died the year after that. He was a wonderful person. As I said, Chan also was the person who started the Breeding Bird Survey and was an incredible supporter of both the CBC and the BBS for his entire life. So this is a sort of a hybrid summary of the 121st and to some extent 120th CBCs. The 121st last season, we had 72,000 participants in the 121st, but like I said, it had been almost 82,000 the season before. It is conducted in about 25 countries in the Western Hemisphere, plus those Pacific Islands. So Canada, United States, throughout, there are a lot of counts in Mexico and in Colombia. It's done throughout Central America, into Brazil, Ecuador, and throughout the Caribbean also. There were 2,646 counts in the 120th, and last year that dropped by about 200 down to 2,459 in the 121st count. Roughly 40 million birds were tallied in both last year and this and the 120th CBC. Now, the interesting thing, and that's roughly about also because we have such a wide geographic span, about 2,500 species. So roughly a quarter of the species of birds in the world are tallied on CBCs every season. The interesting thing and somewhat scary thing that I've been noticing over the last 15 years especially is, despite the fact that almost every year the CBC grows and there are new areas, new countries, a lot more people involved, the number of birds that have been tallied has actually been declining somewhat pretty significantly. We're actually looking into this right now and trying to figure out what we can, this relates back to the 3 billion birds paper that you probably have heard a lot about, that the lab and a bunch of other people published. The decline of the biomass of avian biomass has declined by about 3 billion birds since the 60s. Now, a lot of those birds that were declining have left the continent by the time of the CBC. So what we're really interested in looking at with the CBC is to try to quantify which birds are the ones that are declining most in the winter season up here, because the neotrops are for the most part going to be gone, the ones that go down to Central and South America. In terms of the number of species counted, it's all across the board. The Prudhoe Bay count up in Alaska on the north-south slope, that was done for 18 or 20 years. They only ever found one species of bird. And the big thing was, how many ravens were they going to count? But just think of it. They could have seen a snowy owl. They could have seen any number of, winter gulls or ducks, a king eider or something like that. So they could have doubled or tripled their count in one season, but they never were able to do that. The highest number of species that we've ever had were from some of the counts in Ecuador, where we've had some seasons over 500 species of birds that were actually tallied on count day down there. But the interesting thing is, the average number of species that are seen in North America is probably about 65 to 85 species when you look at the big picture. The sort of long-standing high count species total wise in the U.S. and Canada is the Matagorda County Mad Island Marsh count, and last year they had 224 species. The biggest count in Ecuador wasn't submitted last year, but the Mindo Tandayapa count in Ecuador down there had 374 species. Now, another interesting thing about numbers is that, yes, we don't see as many species up here, but we see lots and lots of birds. Even, maybe 25 ravens can be a lot of birds if you're in Prudhoe Bay in the winter. But, we can get thousands, if not tens or hundreds of thousands, or even sometimes millions of birds on one CBC here in North America. When they coming up with 500 species of birds down in South America, there may only be 1,000 or so, or maybe 3,000 or so total birds. So the diversity is incredibly high, but the number of birds that are actually encountered is very low, and most of the birds down there are only heard. So don't feel too bad about not going down there and seeing 500 species of birds in a day, because any one person on those counts never sees anywhere near that many. So most of you know this, but the Christmas bird count is the rules for the CBC is it has to be done on one calendar day between the dates of December 14th and January 5th every season. Each count is a 15-mile diameter circle, hopefully independent of any other circles. That's, especially in some of the areas like metropolitan Chicago and almost everywhere in the city areas in the Northeast. When the 15-mile diameter circle was instituted, it's grandfathered in a bunch of longstanding counts. So when you look at the maps, a lot of the quote unquote circles do overlap, but the coverage doesn't overlap on any of the counts, or at least that's the goal. Each circle is broken down into areas, sub areas, and people are assigned to an area where you have a party leader and groups of people going out. The party leader is always going to know the birds and the area, and the rest of the people are along to help just, tally everything. New birders are always welcome on CBCs, because just because you don't know what something is doesn't mean, it could, you could be the first one to see something that's new or different or exciting. So I love taking out new birders on CBCs, or also, just on birding expeditions. So everybody goes out, they do their counts, they submit their data, or in most years we would have compilation gatherings where members get together at the end of the day and sort of compare and compile their numbers. Once the compiler is set with the having everything and ready to do their data entry, then they go to the CBC website, which is christmasbirdcount.org. And what the compilers do is they click on the button that says enter your CBC data here. You can also, this is a very completely publicly available. We've got CBC results, which has everything back to 1900 in it. And we also have the join the CBC map is where that map of all the expected circles are. And when you click on that map, you can zoom into any area. You can click on a circle on the icon in the center of the circle, and it will give you the information about hopefully the date, the expected date of the count for the upcoming season, and the compiler's contact information. New observers do need to contact the compilers in advance. It's not like some other counts that we'll talk about in a little while, but the compilers really need to organize their observers. So it's important to, if you want to participate, to be in touch with the compiler ahead of time. So each compiler is, the data entry is login and password protected, as it should be. So everybody has a unique username, which is their email address in full, and whatever password they create. When we started the online data entry system, what we were able to do, instead of me sending out the same booklet with the same list of birds to everybody everywhere, the online data entry system actually has a count-specific history checklist for all the birds that have been seen on that count. So like when Joel logs into the Chicago lakefront count, he gets this initial page, and he doesn't have all those menu options at the top. He'll have the info, compiler, select circle, and then his username. And what he does is he selects the ILCL from the count select circle, and then that will take him to the different parts of the data entry. As I said, we keep careful track of all the effort as well as the number of birds. So people enter the number of field observers, the parties, and hours and miles by 27 different kinds of effort that people always come up with new ideas of how to actually bird on CBCs. But the vast majority of the counting is done either by foot or by car. And then also nocturnal birding and feeder watching. And feeder watching is a slightly separate protocol where you just watch your feeders and take the maximum number of a given species that you see or hear at one time. You don't keep counting chickadees all day or whatever. You just take the maximum number, and that's the number you report. But you do keep track of the hours that you spend watching. And like I said, it's a count-specific historical checklist of the birds that have been seen on that count, and then the compilers can just enter the numbers for the given season. They also have some checklist statistics here. The max per year means the highest number that was seen of that species and which season it was seen in. Also the lowest number that was seen and the season it was seen in. So you can see there's only one greater white-fronted goose seen on the Chicago lakefront count so far. And also the number of occurrences, the number of times it's been seen. So like Canada goose is pretty much every year, and a lot more birds than the white front. So that helps the compiler recognize, if they don't know already, and many of them do, which are the good birds, when it really is a high count number, and then they can check any of those other boxes that they want, if it's high or low, or if they think it's unusual. Once all the compilers have entered their data, then we do have a team of regional editors, and the editors can put in comment codes, and that's what the editor box is there. As soon as a compiler checks that their count is completed, there will be a checkbox that appears up at the top of the page, and they just click it. And then as soon as they do that, their counts appear to the public on the current year's results pages. So this is the screenshot from sort of a third of the way through last season, where there were 986 counts compiled and completed online. And this sort of has a running tally of the total number of birds that were seen at that point on all those counts. So this is publicly available. And you can look at current year by count. You can look at current year by species if you're interested in the boreal owls or the snow buntings or the ivory gulls or whatever in a given season. You can do it that way. And also it will show you, we have the historical results where you can look for either a species over time or a count over time and get the results that way. And anything that you look at, that you can look at through any of the results page, is, if you want to, you can download to your computer. So we've had, lots of people going out and counting lots of birds for lots of years. So what does that do? What does it really mean? And how has this thing developed over time? One of the first studies that was done utilizing CBC data was a look at American black ducks. Now, interestingly, it was the hunters that were actually mentioning that black ducks were declining. And so they started talking to Fish and Wildlife and the state agencies. So actually, the Ducks and Wildlife Research Center and Fish and Wildlife looked at CBC data for American black duck, because American black ducks are, the area where they winter primarily is very well sampled by longstanding Christmas bird counts in the Chesapeake and Delaware Bays and on the East Coast. And as you can see, black ducks have been declining. And interestingly, so it was the hunters that actually reported this. And there have been bag limits now instituted or changed for black ducks because of this documented decline. Looking at CBC data, for a species that's well sampled, and over time, on Christmas bird counts. And you notice that this says the birds per party hour in the x-axis. I mean the y. So it's count year across the bottom, birds per party hour on the vertical. And what we do is you don't want to look necessarily at the raw numbers of birds that are seen every season. What you really want to look is the effort weighted data. So because more people in theory can count more birds, even if there aren't more birds there. So it's the effort weighted data when in all these charts that I'm going to show you, it's effort weighted data that we're looking at in terms of actual birds per party hour, not necessarily the raw numbers. So in front of a live audience, I would throw it out there. What's this bird? We can't do that right now. So this is a ferruginous hawk. And you can use the CBC database. And these are all things that if you've got any, you're just curious about any species, you can go right to the database and just play with it. And you can look at the results and, you know, historical results by species and actually generate these charts that I'm going to show you, that I'm showing you, you know, in this program. If you've got anything, you know, either for the whole country or a state or just a count, it really, you know, it shows you what the trend data are really for these species. So, you know, for ferruginous hawk, this really shows you the history of DDT and conservation, and also other threats that come on raptors that are quite highly specialized. You can see from, you know, the 60s through, you know, what's that around 1973, then or 75, suddenly the numbers start to go up. And what was that? That was when DDT was banned. So the nesting success started growing, you know, being much higher, and the number of ferruginous hawks actually has gone up quite a bit through about, you know, the early 90s. But then it started to drop, and sort of it's up and down at this point. And what this sort of illustrates is what's going on in the grassland areas, and ferruginous hawks are very specialized on prairie dog towns, and, you know, and small to medium sized mammals. So what's happening as farmland is, or as, you know, prairies and grasslands are converted over to farmland, the prairie dogs, and also with ranching, the prairie dogs prairie dog towns are disappearing, and that affects the numbers of ferruginous hawks, as well as a bunch of other things like burrowing owls. It's not all bad news. We can look at things like the boat-tailed and great-tailed grackles. And this is a really cool animated GIF showing what has happened with boat-tailed in the east and great-tailed in the Gulf Coast grackles from the 30s or for the 20s on through the 2010s. And as you can see, the boat tails have expanded up the East Coast, but they kind of stopped right at New York, whereas the great tails have just exploded out through the Southwest, and even, I mean, they're actually now up into British Columbia, and I think they had one in Alaska last year. And I think what we're saying, why the boat tails stopped along the coast is a good question, but the boat-tail grackles are more tied with coastal marshes, whereas great-tailed grackles are also going, you know, following agricultural fields and agriculture. And I think that's what we're seeing here is the great-tails actually expanding out as agricultural conversion has happened in the West. And so these birds have, you know, expanded greatly in as so many species seem to do, in a northwestern vector. Another sort of classic thing that you can track with CBC data are things like the several more southern species that have moved northward over the last, since the 60s at least, or 30s especially. And, you know, cardinal, mockingbird, red-bellied woodpecker, Carolina wren, and sort of the poster child is tufted titmouse. Here we can look at tufted titmice. So the gray dots are counts that didn't include C titmice, and the red dots are the counts where the titmice were seen in these decades. And you can see really that what's happening is it's a combination of more bird feeders, more birders, but also moderating early winter temperatures. And the titmice are, you know, they're all the way up into almost central Quebec now. So it's just, you know, using CBC data like this, you can actually really see where some of these birds are sort of tracking climate change and moderating early winter temperatures northward over time. One of the birds that people are really worried about continentally now is Loggerhead Shrike. It, it used to be sort of the much more common shrike that birders would see. Looking at CBC data, it sort of is clear that loggerheads are dramatically declining across their ranges. It's the questions behind are what's causing this. Again, loggerhead shrikes in some ways they need shrub, emergent shrubs in prairies and grasslands or fields or hedgerows. And a lot of that stuff is disappearing with more and more agricultural conversion. I think it's a similar situation to what seems to be going on with American kestrels. And in some ways, they're in a very similar niche, and they're eating a lot of the same kind of stuff: large insects, and small mammals, and small birds. So loggerhead shrikes are just tanking across the continent. And by the way, on any of these charts that we're looking at, I'm stopping at 115th CBC. The reason for that is actually, if you go to the website and you look at historical results by species, the output is actually broken at this point. So if you try to include anything after the 115th count, you won't be able to get any results. So that's why all these charts stop at 115 for right now. It's something that we need to get fixed. Grassland species. So, shrikes are not specifically grassland, but grassland species like eastern meadowlark and so many of the grassland birds are also really tanking. And you can really see the evidence of that by looking at CBC data. This is eastern meadowlark, and they're just, they're gone. Their numbers are tremendously declining. We can also track just by looking at the data set, the online database. You can sort of track the effects of new disease introductions like West Nile virus. As many of you probably know, West Nile virus really badly hit corvids. So crows, jays, magpies, those kinds of birds, as well as some of the raptors and owls. Great horned owls were very badly hit also. But what you can see here is it was 2003 when the West Nile first came into the New York City area, and you can really see the drop in numbers of American crows. Now, crows are harder because, in terms of just looking at the numbers to figure out what's going on, because they move around a lot and they're also a roosting species. So the reason the numbers are so up and down for crows, like many of things like blackbirds and robins and stuff like that, is if there's a roost that happens to be within a circle, the numbers are going to go way up. But if there isn't a roost in the circle, the numbers, excuse me, are going to go much lower. So that's part of what we're seeing here. But there's a definite decline in American crow on CBCs after the introduction of West Nile, which, if you excuse me, look at the breeding bird survey, you see the same thing. But what about fish crow or some of the other species? Fish crow numbers have varied a lot over the years. There was a real peak back in the mid 80s, but they weren't really too badly hit. There is a somewhat of a drop, but then they've rebounded nicely. So the fish crows weren't as badly hit by West Nile as the American crow. I've heard that there was 99.7% mortality of American crows if they got the disease. So it's pretty hard to come through that bottleneck. There was something like 70% survivorship with fish crows. So that just the small genetic differences between American crow and fish crow made a big difference with something like West Nile. People were really worried, and still are really worried, about yellow-billed magpie, which is an endemic species, as most of you know, in California, because black-billed magpies were very badly hit. So were scrub jays. And you can see what happened with yellow-billed magpies when West Nile got out to the West Coast. Now, with some of the other scrub jays, what we used to call Western scrub jay, the California scrub jay and the Woodhouse's scrub jay, people were very worried what would happen. They were very badly hit. And people were really worried about what would happen when West Nile got to Florida with the Florida scrub jay. And they're, I think, similarly worried about island scrub jays out on Santa Cruz Island. Researchers down there, weren't really seeing any mortality of the Florida scrub jays, but those birds are so well studied, and they're doing blood work on all of them all the time. They started doing testing the blood work on the Florida scrub jay. They all had antibodies to West Nile. They just they really didn't get sick with it. So it's really interesting how differently a disease like that affects some very closely related species. So we're talking about snowy owls a little bit in the beginning. Also with CBC data, you can track things like eruptive species, snowy owls, redpolls, siskins, Bohemian waxwings, pine grosbeaks, all those fun things. That the big year for snowy owls was the 114th count, which was 2013. There were over 1,000 snowy owls tallied on CBCs that year. They do banding on snowy owls at Logan Airport in Boston, and Norm Smith out there in that year banded over 140 snowy owls at Logan Airport. They had one on Bermuda, one got down to Florida. I mean, it was an amazing year. And the reasons behind that, maybe you know this if you've looked at, Project Snowstorm, which was the one where they put trackers on snowy owls that winter. The breeding population of snowy owls is actually much smaller than people thought it was, and that almost the entire North American breeding population that summer prior to, basically in the summer of 2013, was breeding in southeastern Quebec at the very southeastern extreme edge of the Arctic tundra. There was a huge lemming population up there that year. So the numbers that were being produced that season were tremendous. And that's what caused this big eruption of snowy owls that year. One of the things that Audubon is very interested in right now also is the boreal forest, the Canada's boreal forest in the northern United States. The evergreen forests that expand from the Pacific to the Atlantic, and it's basically the breeding ground for so many birds in North America. Now, a lot of the birds that breed up there leave. That's the neotropical migrant warblers, blackpolls, bay-breasted, Cape May, those kinds of things, Swainson's thrushes, olive-sided flycatchers, all those kind of fun things that go to South America and generally aren't seen on Christmas bird counts. Of course, they're the birds that if there's a straggler, that's what everybody wants to find on CBCs, which still can happen. Because we are in the early winter period, but the boreal forest is the real. I mean, it's becoming a critical conservation, effort for Audubon and many other groups. CBCs actually monitor a number of species in the boreal forest that are completely missed in the breeding bird survey because the BBS is a roadside route, and there's very little of there are very few roads and very few routes in the boreal forest or in the tundra. So, but a lot of the birds that we do get on CBCs widely and are well sampled on Christmas bird counts are breeding up in those areas where there are no data from the breeding bird survey. And one of those birds is the American tree sparrow. And tree sparrows are really declining continentally, as you can see on the CBC. Another one, which you don't think about necessarily because they're so common potentially in your yard in the winter, is the white-throated sparrow, at least in the east. Actually, white-throats are declining quite a bit also. And the core breeding range for white-throated sparrows, yeah, you can get them in areas where people do BBS routes, but the core breeding range is really above in the boreal forest, further north. And one species that when we started doing analyses on CBC data that was a real surprise is Harris's sparrow, because there are no BBS routes that cover where Harris's sparrows breed around Hudson Bay. But the core wintering range of Harris's sparrow is very well sampled by the CBC. And you can see that Harris's sparrows are not doing well. So again, it's another one of these things where we can't say what's causing these declines, but we can document the fact that some of these species are declining using CBC data, and then actually go out and try to figure out what are causing the declines and what can we do to address those. And the poster child of declining boreal birds, unfortunately, is rusty blackbird. There used to be roosts of rusty blackbirds in the millions in the southeastern US, and those are gone. They are just not there anymore. And that's what you're seeing in this graph for rusty blackbird. There seems to be a little bit of a resurgence right now, so we're not really totally sure what's going on with them. And some people think, well, they're just, they're dispersed out more and aren't in these big roosts. And there were ideas that maybe these weren't all rusty blackbirds in those tremendous roosts, but I've talked to the people that were actually documenting those roosts, and they know their birds. They were species specific roosts of rusty blackbirds. They weren't mixed blackbirds. So something big is going on with rusties. The Breeding Bird Survey had done a scientific peer review in the late 1990s, I believe. And we realized that, because of the growing importance of the CBC database for conservation use, we realized we actually better do a peer review also. So we invited people, including Jan Robbins and people from across the Americas who utilize CBC data for their analyses, to a sort of a 4-day summit. We had it at Hawk Mountain, actually, and to go over what are we doing right, what are we doing wrong or not so well, and what can we do to improve the program to better have it serve the needs of conservation, of bird conservation. To my delight, the CBC was actually completely embraced by pretty much everybody, and really all it was mostly trying to do tweaks to do things slightly better, and that's we've made a lot of we've done a lot of the recommendations that the peer review panel came up with already, and we're trying to work on the rest. One of the things we know that there are areas and counts that have never really been submitted or only started to be submitted recently to the database, and there's a lot of historical data out there that were done properly and accurately and could be included in the database. And that's one of the things that we're wanting to try to get into, basically enter into the historical database, because the farther back in time we can go, the better data we can get in terms of the trend data that we, which is one of the main things that we look at with Christmas bird count data. One of the things that we sorely need to do right now is completely redo the data entry application. And one of the things that we would like to be able to do is separate out the feeder birds, because right now all the birds just go in, the numbers for all the house sparrows and chickadees or whatever go into one number. And the effort data are separated out, but the actual numbers of birds from the field and feeder watchers are not separated out. So it would probably be a good idea if we can actually parse those numbers out and actually do a separate analysis of feeder data versus field data. And we're also in the process of improving the GIS capability, within the display of CBC data. GIS being, mapping and stuff like that. As I said, when I first started in 1987 and being in charge of the CBC, the scientific community was sort of reluctant to embrace citizen science data sets, as we called it then. Scientists they want to be able to account for every bit of variability that they can in their statistical methods, so that whatever their hypothesis is, they can actually say that yes, we've accounted for all this other stuff in our statistics, so now what we're seeing are actual results and trends or whatever. The two things that really scared scientists in terms of CBC and community science data sets were the weather, because the weather is so variable on any given season, or any given, different regions of different, of the continent every given season, and also the dreaded observer variability. I mean, how does a researcher know that The people in Chicago have the same skill set as the people in Boston or in, you know, Santa Ana or you know, in Anchorage or Prudhoe Bay. So because of that reason, the researchers were very reluctant to actually embrace CBC and community science data sets for their analyses. But what fortunately we had, you know, a team of people at Patuxent Wildlife Research Center where they were in charge of the breeding bird survey, as well as, you know, and we work with them closely doing co-analyses of breeding bird survey and CBC data. And what we realized and what we can say is that, yeah, we don't necessarily know that the people, you know, every single count is done in exactly the same way with exactly the same skill set. But the thing is, it's the same people doing each of those counts in the same way every year for that count. So there's a uniformity of the way every single count is done and the skill set and the way the observers are doing things on a given Christmas bird count. And that all still gives you really good trend data over time. And when you start looking at CBC data in decade-long increments, that takes the weather variability out of the picture as well. So you can really, by looking at, you know, just counts over time in decade chunks, you really do start to get really excellent trend data. And when we've been looking, the species that are sampled by both the Breeding Bird Survey and the CBC, there's a very good agreement in terms of trend data, you know, on BBS and CBC. So therefore, you know, the breeding bird survey gets all the warblers and thrushes and vireos and stuff that are gone mostly from CBC. But the CBC, like I said, brings in the birds that are in the boreal that are wintering down here. In the main core of where CBCs are done. So we get a whole nother subset like Harris's sparrows and white throats and even white-breasted nuthatches and things like that, where we're getting trend data, you know, for those species as well. So over the last 20 years, really CBC has been tremendously embraced by the scientific community. We, you know, Audubon and state and federal wildlife agencies have used CBC data for their winter stuff for like watch lists and everything. Lots of more and more. I mean, there are hundreds and hundreds of scientific papers now that have been published utilizing CBC data. We get requests from researchers on the average of 3 to 5 times a week year-round for CBC data for something that they're looking at, including researchers from areas where, you know, we're not covering their birds. You know, birds and, you know, researchers in Europe and, you know, Australia and, you know, all over the world are requesting CBC data to try to model things and basically try to figure out how to look at the birds that, you know, are in their areas by utilizing the methods of analyzing CBC data. The earliest papers that I could find that were published looking at CBC data were early things on northern shrikes. You know, and the first one that I could find was back in 1933. Just this statistical survey of Ohio winter life. But there was quite a bit of interest by one person, you know, about northern shrikes. And, you know, so people were looking at, you know, species of interest, personal interest to them, and publishing papers by using CBC data. But starting in the 80s, like I mentioned, it was, you know, the studies on black ducks and a few other things that really Greg Butcher and Terry Root are, you know, were the first two researchers that really started to utilize CBC data sets for you know, looking at not only trend data, but also what was happening in terms of range shifting. In 1999, we a combined paper from the Patuxent Wildlife Research Center and Audubon actually published the analytical techniques to use on citizen or community science data sets. They're not specific to the CBC or the BBS or birds, but just the types of statistics that you can utilize if you want to study anything that any data set that was that are generated by you know, community science observers. So what using CBC and BBS, what we did is we actually published analytical techniques to be able to analyze any sort of citizen science or community science data set that's out there in any field. And there are lots and lots of community science data sets and citizen science data sets, more and more every year being done now. So in 2006, what we did was we actually analyzed, we started trying to really quantify range shifting as documented by the Christmas bird count, because we have the data, we have the weather data, we have the bird data, and we could really start to look at what's happening with species and are they moving, are they shifting their ranges over time. What we did is we looked at the center of abundance of species that are well sampled across the continent on CBC. And what the center of abundance is where would you go if you wanted to find the most American robins or the most snow geese or the most red-breasted nuthatches. It's not the northern edge or the southern edge, but where are you either most likely to encounter that species or find the most of that species? That's the center of abundance. And what we looked at is, what we discovered is that many species over the since the 1960s have shifted their center of abundance of their ranges as much as 200 miles northward, and also 200, inland away from the coasts. CBCs are really well sampled across all the bird conservation regions, which is one of the ways that ornithologists look at analyzing bird data. And what, as you can see, the red dots are where the circles are, and the different colored blobs on the map are all the bird conservation regions. And it's really, CBCs are pretty well sampled across almost everything except the high Arctic. What we saw is that, what we documented is that more species, the species diversity is increasing inland and northward, and it's decreasing southward and coastally. So what that is it's basically illustrating exactly what's going on with the moderating early winter temperatures that's affecting where the birds are seen and what birds are seen on Christmas bird counts in what numbers. Purple finch has shifted its range, the center of abundance of its range, or about 200 miles northward. Now this is a hard one because it's also an eruptive species. But when, again, that sort of plays out over time when you look at trend data, and the center of abundance has been shifting northward over the last 60 years. Flickers also as much as 200 miles northward are where they are in the winter. And this is, they're not an eruptive species as much. You can sort of tell that by the way the line's increasing up the chart. But not everything is moving northward. Common ravens have really moved southward, like about 200 miles for their center of abundance. This is a whole different scenario. This is ravens recolonizing areas coastally and in the primary continental areas of North America, where they were pretty much extirpated during the industrial era. But what we did, the way we created wonderful habitat for red-tailed hawks by devising the interstate highway system, we put up cell phone towers all over the place. And ravens have really taken to nesting on cell phone towers. Plus, they're not being shot anymore. They're just wonderfully adaptive birds, and basically they're recolonizing much of North America where they used to be. You can also track some of the species that are more that are not migratory, that don't know what migration means, like Carolina wren, and you can really track what happens to them for the severity of the winter based on where they are. And you can tell, I see this in my backyard here in Western Massachusetts, where we always have Carolina wrens down along the Connecticut River, like in Northampton, but we're about 15 miles inland and about 500 feet higher than Northampton, and 2 severe winters in a row knocks out the Carolina wrens here in town. And that's really what you can see in this graph of, sort of tracking the severity of one, and especially if there are 2 severe winters in a row, where the Carolina wrens are and in what numbers really goes up and down. So based on documenting with CBC how birds have been shifting their ranges, what Audubon did in 2012-13 was to do our second Birds and Climate Change report, where instead of looking at what have they done, we try to look at, based on climate change scenarios, what's likely to happen to where are they going to be in the future, 2030, 2050, 2080, based on climate change, potential climate change scenarios. So it was sort of a prediction of where birds might need to go in a changing climate. And we look at burrowing owl, and where the summer range is the yellow, the winter range is the blue, and you can see that for burrowing owl, the summer range is kind of mostly disappearing. So this is a potential real issue for burrowing owls if we don't actually figure out what we're doing in terms of climate change. Chestnut collared longspur and a couple of the other grassland species out there are really at risk. You can see that their summer range, the habitat that they need, the environmental conditions that they need in the summer are probably going to disappear. They won't necessarily have to shift. There won't be any place for them to shift. So this chestnut collared longspur and Baird sparrows is just as grim in terms of, these highly specialized grassland species are potentially going to be in real trouble. But there were a lot of the initial climate change study was broad in scope, and that's why the Christmas bird count was the data set that was used to model the wintering data for the first climate change study. What we wanted to do is make it a lot more fine-tooth and bring in a lot of other environmental factors, and that's what we did in 2019 with the survival by degrees study, which you may or may not have heard of. And again, these are on the Audubon website. So what the CBC data weren't specifically used in this one, but it set the ground rules for the way we analyzed the results. And we basically, what we looked at was about 600 species and where, what's likely to be happening with them over time. This is a little more interactive. It's a much more interactive website. It actually, you can type in a zip code. You can look at the birds that are at risk or not at risk in your area. And it also gives you some ideas of things that you can do to help, address, even in your backyard, to address issues that will help things for some of the birds that are more at risk, that are more highly specialized. So this is where you can enter your zip code if you want to or you can do, you can do species searches on these also. Another thing that we're doing with CBC data right now is we're looking at almost all the data that we've analyzed so far, and almost all the published papers on utilizing CBC data are looking at the 60s to the present, because we can co-analyze the breeding bird survey and the Christmas bird count from the 60s to the present, because the breeding bird survey was started in 1966. But there are a lot of really interesting data in the CBC that were done prior to that. So what we're looking at are what we're calling very long-term trends. And this one is mourning dove, and it kind of shows you something that I had not realized. I mean, we talked about, tufted titmouse and cardinals and stuff like that earlier, but mourning dove is another one that's tremendously moved northward, since the 1930s or 40s. And one of the reasons I realized this is because we got a request from a researcher looking at mourning dove data in Quebec, and there weren't any CBC data for mourning doves prior to about 1970. And I was like, really? And that's what this is showing. Mourning doves are another one of these species that has dramatically shifted its range northward over time. We can also look at things like sharp-shinned hawks, where what we're seeing, one of the things that seems to be happening with sharp-shins is they're short stopping, actually. They're not going as far south as they used to. And that's sort of what we're seeing here with the increasing number of sharpshins that are being reported in more recent years as opposed to the earlier years on CBC. So the CBC isn't the only community science program that Audubon runs. And I should point out that Audubon has shifted over using the term community science rather than citizen science, because the word citizen can have negative connotations and be an impediment to for people to participate in some regions, because it implies citizenship, which is of course not what it means at all. But because there was, when we were trying to engage local communities and in school groups and whatever, if they're worried about something having the word citizen in it, it was an impediment, and they weren't wanting to come and join on the CBC. So Audubon has voluntarily shifted over to calling it community science to try to address that issue, and it seems to have it's been embraced. So the CBC is the one we've been mostly talking about. We also have I should mention also that our partner in Canada is Birds Canada. Birds Canada actually manages the CBC up there, and I coordinate with their CBC coordinator, who's Yusuf Attia up there. He's in British Columbia. So we work very closely with Birds Canada. Also, we work with the Laboratory of Ornithology at Cornell in Birds Canada to run the Great Backyard Bird Count, which happens in President's Day weekend. Because the CBC has a fair amount of methodology, it can be hard it's not really a suitable activity for like groups of kids and stuff like that, or school groups. But the Great Backyard Bird Count is a wonderful introductory experience to counting birds anywhere you want, in any way you want, and so it's a great engagement activity that then can help people to start to move into other things like the Christmas bird count and Audubon's newer community science program called Climate Watch, where what Climate Watch is it's a specifically designed program to track and document whether our predictions from the Survival by Degrees report are holding true for the species that should be or are expected to be shifting their ranges. So what Climate Watch does is it's got a little bit even more standardized protocol than the Christmas bird count, it really this is its fourth year, and there's a summer season and a winter season where people go out and look for specific species in areas where they either are expected to be moving into or moving out of over time. So here's GBBC. The next one will be February 18th to 21st, and Climate Watch. One of the things that you can do now, we just introduced this new feature on the CBC website, is our trend viewer. And you can choose any species that's sampled on the CBC from the drop-down menu, and you can look at it. So, this is an example for black duck, and it shows you where they're increasing, where they're decreasing, and the types of statistics around what they're doing. You can also look at different timelines. You can look at by state and province, by bird conservation region, just by country, or just the whole continent. For almost anything that's sampled, we've got, I forget how many species that are in there right now. So, and again, as with the other results pages, anything that you find here, you can actually download to your computer. This shows you that, the black duck for BCRs. So we look at things like house sparrows, and you may have heard that house sparrow is actually on the endangered species list in England. It's really declining. They're declining here too. And, people don't like house sparrows, but it's interesting that, for such an adaptable and intelligent species, birds, they're telling us what's going on with the environment. And it's the environment we all live in. And, house sparrows are kind of going down. And I don't think this is because people aren't bothering to count them on CBCs. I do feel that there is a decline in the number of house sparrows. And what starlings? Everybody's other not favorite. Even more so, they're declining. They seem to be declining. And I've seen this personally. There used to be tremendous roosts in some of the areas of starlings, and I haven't seen a huge starling roost in years. So there's something going on, but not everything is bad. Merlins. Have you been seeing more Merlins lately on Christmas counts? You should. So I love Merlins. They're like the scrappiest little raptors out there. maybe they're eating all those American tree sparrows. But anyway, so here's the distribution of CBCs that we think are going to come in this year, and here's the distribution of where humans are. And you see that we need, at least at night, we need to get more CBCs down in southern Brazil and maybe around Buenos Aires and stuff like that. But really, CBCs really pretty much do cover where everybody is in the Western Hemisphere. And it really can tell us an awful lot about what's going on with the birds and the environment. So with that, I will say thank you, and I will stop sharing and be happy to take questions.
Holy moly, that is a lot of information to digest there and a lot of really fascinating insights. First and foremost, everybody, can we get a big round of virtual applause here for Jeff? Thank you so much for sharing your deep knowledge and expertise on this topic. I definitely think we should at least consider sponsoring Chicago Ornithological Society CBC expedition to Buenos Aires. I think we probably have a lot of volunteers here. I certainly volunteer for that expedition.
Just last year, we finally had one in the Galapagos too.
Oh, nice. Hey, I'm sure that's an expedition we would love to join as well. So on that note, we have several questions that have been piling up here in the chat box. So I'll go ahead and just call you folks out who had questions. If you'd like to unmute yourself and ask your question in person, please do so. So first one, we've got Becca Halstead. I hope I didn't mispronounce your last name there. You had a couple of questions. You want to unmute yourself and ask?
I think I actually got the answers that I needed, but I really appreciate it and the help from the chat. Thank you.
Certainly. Let's see. Mary Zenner, you had a question. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, I was wondering how, if eBird is going to start interfacing in a more useful way for using it during CBCs so that you can do a day list and all that without too much trouble.
We are working with eBird to try to figure out a way of at least having eBird provide a method of getting results to compilers. The challenge with the reason the CBC, I should say, I mean, CBC data set is not in eBird, even though actually the CBC data set is what enabled eBird to happen. When we started the computerization of the CBC data set, it was actually what we created for the beginning of what was called Bird Source, which is what eventually has become eBird. But the thing with eBird is they want location and checklist specific data, whereas the CBC data for each count or pooled data for the entire circle. So what eBird checklists can do, as long as they are from people who are officially part of the CBC, so that the effort data are also carefully tracked, is those eBird checklists can go to the compiler, and then the compiler enters the data into the CBC dataset database. So that's what we're working with the eBird folks on right now, and the trip list thing that they just are getting ready to announce, if they haven't already, is one way is one step toward that. I should say that there are tons of checklists from CBCs that are in eBird, but there's no CBC flag in eBird. So I know people that I've been out with every year submitting checklists throughout the day to eBird, but those don't come directly to the compiler or into the CBC database.
I think this is kind of a related question here, but Mary Drovic, you had a question. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask? Mary Drovic, you still there? I might also be butchering your last name, in which case that's on me. Well, Mary was asking in particular, just the different methods of doing the counts. How are those kind of recorded, right? So the difference between, say, birds that you get while you're walking versus birds that you get while you're driving.
In the effort section, the compilers tally, each field party keeps track of their hours and miles by foot and car. And then the compiler sums those and enters those into the different subsets of, each listing on that effort page that I had a quick shot of. So there's hours and distance by car, hours and distance by foot, hours and distance by car, hours and distance by motorized boat, by non-motorized boat, wheelchair, golf cart, horseback, all sorts of things like that, where, all the different methods where people actually do their field work are tallied separately in the effort section, and then those tally up to the full hours and miles that are go into those effort weighted data for the birds per party hour.
Isn't there also, I think there's also a sled dog option, right?
There is.
So there you go. Another goal.
Actually, one thing that we don't have, which I wish we did, which is one of the definite things that we want to get in there for the next iteration of is stationary, because it's not quite the same thing as feeder watching, but a lot of people, like people doing sea watches, or if you had a hawk watch or something like that, that's a stationary count where you're just in one place, so that's time, no distance, and counting birds.
So just a big sit, but Christmas style.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, we got a question from Kathy Garnis. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask that question?
My questions have to do with, are there any ways to quantify the loss of birds and the impacts from habitat losses and like acreage of habitat converted to urban areas or agriculture and that, and also the loss of birds due to increased amounts of pesticides? I know that those are two, they both contribute to our bird declines. I'm wondering if anybody's actually tried to separate those out.
These are the threats to species are very, very much of interest to Audubon and other bird conservation organizations, because just for exactly, we want to learn what are the biggest threats for certain species, and it's part of the thing that went in to the survival by degrees study, as opposed to the first birds and climate change study. Was looking at the threats to those species in those regions. That yes, we are trying to look at, for some of the ongoing studies that are going on, and I know this isn't just Audubon that's doing this. We are looking at what is happening with agricultural conversion, pesticide application, water table stuff, wetlands health, window kills, certainly, things like, wind industry and solar also can have significant impacts if they're not sited properly, in terms of trying to come up with, carbon neutral, future. So all these things are really, any sort of significant threat. We try to, when we're looking at a specific species, we try to quantify what are the things that are most likely to affect that species or that group of species, and then look at what can we do to address those issues.
Okay, I don't see any other questions in the chat. Last call. All right.
I'd like to say one little, or not so little thing in closing, is I'm really glad that everybody's here. And the first 10 or 20 years that I've been in charge of the CBC, Audubon's big mission was to promote the importance of CBC to bird conservation to the scientific community. And that has happened in gangbusters. I mean, the last second to last North American Ornithological Congress, the one that was down in DC, there were whole symposia that were being given utilizing CBC data toward bird conservation. And it was really heartwarming to witness that change, that wholehearted change that has happened. It's a sea change, really, in terms of the scientific community looking at the value of CBC and community science data sets. What I've been realizing as I'm giving programs over the last few years is that the people that are doing the CBC haven't quite gotten that fact yet. So I'm always very happy to talk about really how important the efforts of every one of you are to bird conservation by participating in a Christmas bird count. Just going out and counting another flock of chickadees or yes, house sparrows. That's meaningful, and it's a meaningful contribution. And I realize now that what Audubon needs to do is get that word out there even more to the participants and the general public, and not just the scientific community.
Yeah, I really appreciate you capping off on that and not ride your thunder a little bit. I mean, I know I see a lot of names on this call. I was seeing in the chat kind of here. We have folks on here who have been doing CBCs for years. We have folks here who were saying that they've never done one before, but they would like to participate this year. I know for me, I've started out as a young birder here in the Chicagoland area, and some of my kind of most formative birding experiences and memories come from CBCs, even just, when it was just a really dumb slog through the snow to count that house sparrow, right? But it's really amazing now to kind of listen to you who gets that other end of it here and really see just how important every single one of those years we're out there, every single observation we're making, it all matters. So I just, again, I can't express how much we appreciate you spending your time with us this evening, really putting this all in perspective, sharing your knowledge, and thank you. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Well, you're entirely welcome. And I did see the question that came in about how do I get more kids involved, that popped up in the chat just now. And I think that kids one by one, or in 2 by 2 are great, because it becomes that mentoring on a CBC. It becomes that mentoring experience for them. And they're so enthusiastic, at least for a short period of time. But they're one-on-one or small group, basically individual mentoring for kids on CBCs is a way of doing it right now. Maybe the better way of getting groups of kids involved is to encourage school groups, scout groups, church groups to do the Great Backyard Bird Count, because that's specifically, that's a wonderful activity for a group of kids or anybody. And then what they can do is once they learn a little bit about protocol and how to actually count the birds and how to use binoculars, then they're better able to come onto a field party for CBCs, which again is a little bit more in depth and more communication, or more protocol, harder. And I see the questions coming in about how to join in. The best way is to go to that map of active circles in the Join the CBC link on, again, the Christmas Bird Count website is christmasbirdcount, all one word, to run together.org. And there's a Join the CBC link. And on there's a map of active circles, and you can zoom into your area. And when you click on the icon in the center of the circle, it will give you the compiler's contact information and if they've entered the upcoming date. So that's the best way to get involved.
And I'll also emphasize, you saw the map that Jeff brought up earlier, but there's at least a dozen different counts taking place in the Chicagoland area, and several more just beyond it. All of them are excellent counts with some really great coordinators that are contributing to this effort. So definitely head over to that website, take a look, send those people an email, sign up. It was mentioned in the chat, it's free. In EOS's case here, the one that we particularly sponsor and support is the Nile bird count, which will be taking place on the southwest side of Cook County on December 19th. You can find that information on our website, chicagobirder.org. You can also send us an email to sign up at cbc@chicagobirder.org. So there's a lot of opportunities. I saw some folks talking about earlier, can I do more than one? Yes, you absolutely can do more than one. So go for it. Go gangbusters on CBCs.
There's one guy, Kelly McKay, who lives in Iowa. He tries to do, there's 23 days in the CBC period, and he tries to do 23 Christmas bird counts every season,
Oh,
including, by the way, the Chicago Lakefront count.
there you go. There you go. So, hey, you know what? If anybody in here is looking for a major goal, has a lot of time on their hands, there you go.
One of the unique things I meant to mention about the Chicago Lakefront count is that it's actually done on Christmas Day.
Yep.
All the original 25 counts were done on Christmas Day, and very few are done on Christmas Day now. But Chicago Lakefront is always done on December 25th.
So you just really need to get away from the family on Christmas morning. You know where to go.
Oh, go look for the ivory gull.
Yeah, look for that ivory gull, chase those ducks, get that lakefront snowy owl. You know, Joel Greenberg, he's your guy.
Yeah.
All right, on that note, I'm going to go ahead and close it down here for the evening. Once again, thank you so much, Jeff. Really appreciate it. As we mentioned at the beginning, this has been recorded. So if you've got friends or buddies who didn't make it this evening and wanted to learn a little bit more, certainly head over to our website, chicagobird.org. We will be following up with an email to everybody here with some of the information that was mentioned here in this program. And then additionally, yeah, once again, if you are not a member of Chicago Ornithological Society, why the heck not? You get amazing programs like this for free, open to the public, and opportunities to go forth and count all the winter birds and do all the CBCs. So thank you all so much for joining us here tonight. Be safe, be warm, and we will see you hopefully at one of many CBCs this winter, and hopefully our next episode of Birds and Bytes, which will be taking place on December 2nd. Have a good night, everybody.
Bye, everybody.